Okay, greetings all. So, updates first and foremost. Of course, we're right in the middle of a series of videos coming out of Munster from Wargaming, and it's another 2 vehicles after the Panzer IV, and then I'm on my own. So, editing has started on the series of videos filmed in Sweden. 1 vehicle so far completed. The whole trip wasn't quite as successful as I'd hoped, only 6 vehicles covered, but a good learning experience which I plan on putting to good use on the next trip, which is in March. So if you are in Rio Grande do Sul, give us a holler. Particularly if you happen to be in the town of Santa Maria, although I think Porto Alegre is possible. Similarly, I do not expect to be at College Station, as I'm likely on an airplane to St. Petersburg for most of the week. The one in Russia, not Florida. There will almost certainly not be a Q&A in June. I get to spend pretty much the entire month in a swamp in Louisiana. JRTC beckons. I presume I'll need to bring along all the bug spray, which will fit in my ammo pouches. May not have much time for a meeting, but if you're in the area, I'll do my best. It does mean that I won't be at a Kino weekend this time, and that's the event in Toronto. Sorry, the Army wins. On the plus side, I get released soon enough to drive home, take a shower, and then probably hop onto an airplane for Tankfest. If anyone knows a source of 58 pattern webbing in the US, let me know. Doesn't have to be in great condition, just needs to last 1 event. Anything I can find seems to be UK based and has daft shipping charges. And finally, well, another plug for my book. Apparently, there are still unsold copies. Amazon and Panzerex both have them, and I think the Ontario Regiment Museum as well. Anyway, all that done, to the questions, and I need to go back on 2 items from last video. Firstly, it has been astutely pointed out to me in my response to the question about stereoscopic or coincidence range finding that I've been spending too much time in museum pieces. There is, in theory, no particular reason why such a system cannot be electronically controlled by use of 2 cameras, one on each side of the turret, connected by a mere electronic cable to a small computer. They would not be big, they would not consist of a huge crossbeam through the turret. Although I stand by my earlier comments about the velocity and trajectory of the rounds being, well, these days, less of an issue for range estimation errors, as I do the possibility of a choke or mil calculation ranging, I must admit to not having completely thought the answer through. If you do feel the need to put a coincidence rangefinder in, I see no reason that it can't be done without any particular liability. I'm just not sure it's worth it. Also, I owed Kazuki K his or her questions from last month, which I had to edit out due to an audio failure. If one considers the original design intent, would Panther have been a more reliable and strategically useful tank had WWII 6 either demanded the earlier 35-ton specification or the Daimler T-34 copy had been adopted instead? I'd say they were hosed either way. Without looking up the exact figures, I would think the Panther would have been about as problematic an opponent had the frontal armor been 1 or 2 centimeters thinner, given what was on the battlefield, and that would have resulted in a few less tons to move around. However, I don't think a 35-ton Panther would have been the right result either. It's too easy to knock out. Given German production rates, they had to try for a qualitative superiority. And that also is why the Daimler design did not get built. The MAN design would be able to be placed into production sometime faster than the Daimler one, even though there are definite arguments in favor of the Daimler design. Which, also in fairness, is not really fair to say it was a direct T-34 copy, with its leaf springs and a big turret. His second question, and this one comes out of left field. Is the tow launcher on a Bradley electrically or hydraulically raised? Now I'm going to go to electric for 3 reasons. 1, for the life of me, I don't recall ever seeing or hearing anything hydraulic in the turret. 2, the manual I have states that if you keep trying to raise the launcher for more than 13 seconds, damage will result, and I suspect this implies motor burnout. 3, unlike the hydraulic engine bay cover at the front, which is raised manually by pumping a handle back and forth, actually side to side technically, the manual method for raising the tow launcher involves a socket wrench right here. As for how much maintenance is given to the system, nothing I ever had to deal with. It might be something in annual services, but I never got around to those. And so we move to the questions for this month, starting with one from Daniel Herndon, which I seem to have completely missed because I never checked the right page on the Subscribe Star account. Sorry about that. As ever, most of these questions are from patrons, but a few also come from comments on other videos. So, his question: how fast did combat crews receive upgrades? Might they have had the same tank through the war? Was dry stowage ever completely eliminated? The general rule of thumb was it took about 5 months for a tank to get from the factory floor to the front line. And yes, that involves quite a bit of waiting around in rail yards, dockyards, ordnance depots, and the likes. And, of course, the tanks competing with everything else, waiting to go overseas. It generally took a German tank about 2 weeks. Their supply line was just a little bit shorter, and they didn't normally have to worry about things like de-waterproofing after a North Atlantic voyage. This thus explains why, though the 76mm M4 entered production in January 44, it did not get to the field units until May, and even then, of course, they were left behind due to lack of time for training and rejiggering the logistics. It is worth noting, thus, that the vast majority of US tanks which landed in Normandy were built with no loader's hatch, as that only started coming off the lines about November of 43. Now, that's not to say, though, that the tanks did not receive the benefit of a number of upgrades over their period of service life. They could vary a fair bit. So, for example, you could find that an early M4 would have the modification to the sight linkage, which was known for being a little bit unreliable. Later on, a tank unit supply officer could find he's taken delivery of springs to make opening the hatches easier. Or perhaps one crate came with enough hatches and instructions for installing the loader's hatch into a tank which wasn't built with one. This sort of work was well within the capabilities of the field ordnance units. Alternatively, perhaps upgrades would be part of a replacement. For example, all the M4A4s were built with the old 3-piece transmission housing, as people now suddenly go looking for pictures of Firefly 5C photos to check. Yet on occasion you will find an M4A4 with a single-piece housing, the latter of course being tougher and more reliable. It's possible that this M4A4 had a transmission swapped out and they just found it easier to change out the entire assembly with the housing rather than to remove the transmission from the housing and then install it into a new one. Now, one may ask why the M4s were not modified with upgraded suspensions as well. I have heard an argument that the VVSS and HVSS bogies had different bolt hole locations and required welding, but examination of a small hatch M4A1 with HVSS indicates that this is not true. Some conversions are reputed to have happened, but it seems to just not have been considered worthwhile. Bear in mind that factory-produced HVSS vehicles only started arriving in December of 44. It's unlikely that either enough spare bogies would have been around to install, or, frankly, that the ordnance crews considered it a productive use of their time, given everything else that was going on. So, in theory at least, a crewman could have started his war in a Sherman in North Africa with one tank and finished it in 1945 in Italy in the same tank, but one which would have been somewhat upgraded to nearly the standard of a tank built a year and a half later. There's a famous enough small hatch M4A1 which made it to Germany before being knocked out. Quite early production, you can see the center mounted return rollers and 3-piece housing, but on the other hand it also has the full suite of applique armor, and the commander's hatch has been replaced by the far superior direct vision single-piece hatch. The reality though is that a crewman will have likely received a new tank somewhere along the line. You will see veterans commenting on the occasional tank in their unit which lasts from D-Day to the surrender, but also as an example of a rarity. The chances were that a vehicle would have been disabled sufficiently by something, be it an accident, a mine, enemy fire, or whatever, to require drawing a replacement from stocks while the crew's original vehicle was repaired. Or that it had just run so much that it needed a major overhaul sufficient to warrant drawing a replacement, and the tank would have been given more upgrades if available and then returned to the pool for future disbursement. Another possibility is that of cascading equipment. So Creighton Abrams, for example, is known for having commanded 7 tanks in his war, all of them called Thunderbolt. Of course, being the boss, he had the privilege of rank and could nab new tanks as they were delivered. That meant, though, that his previous best tank would be cascaded down to a new crew. Unless a crew were particularly emotionally attached to their tank, that is, but I can't imagine many crews turning down a better vehicle just because of an emotional attachment. So the oldest and least capable tank would be withdrawn from primary service. Dry stowage was never entirely eliminated. Admiral Tiberius is asking what was the role for the 175mm, 203mm and 240 artillery pieces in the US inventory. The 240s were gone after Korea, but you will not believe how many different TOEs there were for field artillery units in the 1960s, so look for a link in the text below dated July 1968 from Fort Sill. The general trend seems to have been that brigades had 155mm battalions in support, divisions had battalions of 3 155 batteries and 1 8-inch battery, and you would have to go up to corps level to find the pure 8-inch battalions and the 175mm battalions. When it was developed, the M107 175mm was slated to become the primary heavy artillery piece of the Army. The M110 was brought into service mainly because of the ridiculous amount of 8-inch ammunition that was available to burn through. After a while, it was planned that the 8-inch guns would be converted to 175mm, making a full M107 fleet. However, things turned out going the other direction entirely. M107s had a habit of wearing out after only a couple hundred rounds, and they were not known for their accuracy nor their rate of fire. They could, however, be used for interdiction and counter-battery, such was their range. Investigations prompted by the catastrophic failures of the 175mm barrels were used to create new metallurgical techniques, which were then applied to the M110A2, the 8-inch gun on the same mount. This suffered almost none of the drawbacks of the M107, made a bigger bang at the far end, and was only a couple of kilometers shorter range than the smaller gun. Eventually, they were replaced in US service by MLRS. Commissar Carl is inquiring as to the British preference for shot M61 over shell M61 for the 75mm gun. The difference being that the one has over 2 ounces of explosive filler for post-penetration effect and the other does not. The British tended to use the one without filler. It is not impossible that they filled some cavities with inert material to both reinforce the structure and increase the mass, but they definitely seem to have fired them with a cavity instead of any filler at all. One thing which is certainly true is that the British observed that if you fired the shell at a vehicle with spaced armour, you had a chance of premature detonation. In reality, though, there weren't all that many vehicles which had it, and I doubt Schutzen alone would detonate the base fuse. Another possibility is that the British felt that they had better things to do with their explosives than to put small charges into anti-tank rounds. Don't forget, in addition to pots and pan drives for aluminium or steel, citizens were also asked to save cooking fat for use in explosives. It's all part of the efficient war effort. If you're curious, the conversions were that a pound of waste fat allowed for 1/3 of a pound of gunpowder or a 1/2 pound of dynamite. At any rate, I have not encountered anything in the American archives discussing the British preference for shot over shell. Alexander H. What can I tell you about combat identification panels? Which I actually, here's one. Let me grab it out of this here. I think I have one on the M1. They come in a couple of different types. Some are simple squares and others have these sort of louver effects. The gist of it, though, is that the thermal imagers on the M1 and the M1A1 in the late 80s and early 90s were very, very good at finding targets, but not so good at identifying them. It's not a black and white TV screen image like a lot of computer games or movies would have you think. There is a lot of bloom and blur. Plus, it pains me to say it, but I personally consider that the standards of US Army AFVID testing are to be woeful. I'm sure the British would have more to say on that particular matter as well. The CIPs are a simple solution. They're made of a different material to the armour, and oftentimes, such as here, there's an air gap as well between the panel and the armour itself. This means that when viewed through a thermal imager, there is a big rectangular contrast in the middle of the vehicle. In times when, generally speaking, only you and your friends have thermal imagers, this makes fantastic sense. Of course, now we're trying to reduce thermal signatures overall in the first place, so one can rely less upon this. Which does beg the question of IFF systems. So on the Bradley ODS, there's a rocker switch for the laser rangefinder. One direction, if you kick forward, it interrogates the target at the same time as ranging it. However, I have never seen a similar switch on contemporary M1s, and neither was there anything in the Bradley about a transponder receiver system. I can only assume that it was an idea that was never implemented, and I cannot speak as to the current M1s and M2s, although I suspect that Blue Force Tracker is supposed to deal with the problem anyway. Jonathan Schreiber is asking my opinion about the potential utility of the fourth crewman as a systems operator or some similar function to prevent information overload on the commander. And I will refer the honourable gentleman back to the Wither the Autoloader video I put up a while ago, and I'll put it up as an end card. Many of those functions do not require a human to be in the same vehicle, and the space taken up by the fourth body is probably better utilised by not being there in the first place. Make the tank smaller and tougher. My personal opinion. However, he also asks, given that tanks keep increasing in size, is there a requirement for a new class of light tanks? Well, yes and no. Light tanks are still alive and well, just not in NATO. As opposed to the fire support roles, such as the MGS or AGS, look instead at vehicles like the Type 15 from China, or even the old Stingray. It's designed as a tank, just one which operates where the heavier tanks cannot. However, there also seems to be a recent trend for new tanks to be lighter anyway. Type 10, K2, T14, they're all around under the 50-ton mark, which makes them some 20 tons or more less than the M1. And they're still considered to be MBTs. Even Leclerc is 15 tons lighter than M1. I refer you back to the advantage of not having the fourth man. Still, all other things being equal, if the US can transport and use a 70-ton tank with the same technologies that are being used in the current sub-50 tonners, it would stand to reason that a 70-ton tank would be more dangerous. Of course, it does beg the question, what do the Chinese know about certain terrain that the US does not? After all, the Type 99A is still over 10 tons lighter than the M1, and they feel the terrain won't work for those. Rich Botsford wants to know about Thumper's current status, and honestly I have no idea where it is. I've done a little bit of digging. I've had a document dated 1998 which postulated the M1A3 with a 140mm cannon, an autoloader, and a stronger titanium turret. Though that document and a few others make mention of the significant power and capability of the 140mm round, with almost double the chamber size, the limitations of being able to stow only 30 rounds due to the size of the things and the ridiculous cost of the program led them to conclude that the slight increase of capability over the M1A2 with new ammo was simply not worth the cost. Andrew wants to know what British infantry tanks were supposed to do. He postulates that given they had anti-tank guns of limited utility for supporting infantry, that the guns would kill armour and that machine guns would be enough for the rest. He's entirely correct. The British firmly believed that if possible a tank should have a gun capable of defeating other tanks. After all, they engaged in tank versus tank battles in World War I, and thus the use of the 3-pounder in the medium tanks of the 1920s. Yet note that Matilda came with only a single machine gun. It really was just a self-propelled machine gun bunker, not particularly fast, fairly heavy, but with a Vickers. Matilda II gave the tank a proper crew and an anti-tank gun. I will again take this opportunity to reinforce that infantry support means dealing with things your infantry are facing, which can include enemy armour. Still, the majority of targets that were expected to be faced were to be the ones that the infantry were facing within rifle range. And if an anti-tank gun showed up, well, hence you had 3 inches of armour. Of course, events in the desert were to prove the death of this concept of machine guns being almost the exclusive weapon.
Christopher Whitmer, what general advice would I give someone writing about and creating fictional tanks, such as important considerations of capturing the crew's experience? For the record, these will be magic-based tanks, which will engage tanks and fantasy creatures. Given these parameters, it seems to me there is nothing in terms of technical guidance I can give you. For all I know, the track tension is magically performed. You're going to have to focus on the crew, but I suspect that interaction has been pretty much a constant since the first tanks and will remain a constant well into the future. I see no reason why it should be anything other in a fantasy tank. Obviously, you're going to have to come up with your own constructs and crew duties given the fantastic capabilities of the vehicle. However, presuming a hierarchical structure similar to a modern military, you're going to have two levels of interactions. The operational or rank-based interaction is going to be first level, and the social interaction will be the second. Although obviously the commander is the most important person for the functioning of the vehicle and for operational cohesion of the crew, that isn't necessarily the case for the social cohesion of the crew. The social center, the person who's the central gel in making a tank crew work, could be the most junior person, be it he's the jokester or the intermediary or whatever works. Instead of developing crew actions as you go along, you need to plan out in advance the characteristics of the crew. Figure out what the TC's personality is first. Now remember, though doubtless your writing will focus on the interesting parts of the tank's participation in the storyline, a tank crew spends most of its time bored out of their skulls. When they're not bored out of their skulls, they are doing tracked engine, complaining about why they're not bored out of their skulls or whatever. And that's the foundation which sets up the basis for the interaction of the interesting bits that you actually are writing about. Once you can envision how your crew will interact off stress, that should give you a clue as to how they react under stress, and especially in the little gaps or idle moments in or after the action. Black humor is always possible. If you want to believe a magical tank, well, that's your best bet. Focus on the crew. Even bolos are appealing because of their thoughts and interactions, not because of the weapons. Opperboil.nl, which I'm going to guess is a Dutchman. How does one combat the turret monster? Well, tradition holds that you must, before your training exercise, make a sacrifice to the turret monster. Normally you bring along a spare pen or something and you just drop it in the hope of sating the monster's hunger. I have no doubt that the mechanics, when mucking around its sub-turret floor, have found many unusual items. Tea and sheep. My favourite meal whilst tanking in the field. We got some pretty damn good meals off the Iraqis, I have to say. The ones that weren't shooting at us were incredibly generous, and the grilled meat was often very good, although I'm not so keen on the camel. Stay away from the lactic acid though. Be warned, it looks just like milk. Outside of that, it's really just MREs. The vegetarian manicotti was universally disliked. I was particularly fond of the chili and macaroni, mainly because it was palatable tasting whether it was heated or not. Some meals, you pretty much had to heat them. The front slope, by the way, makes an excellent dining table. Not quite as good as the Humvee due to the slope, but perfectly serviceable, and of course the fenders work well as well. At least if you're my height. Kazuki K's question for this month is if there are any documented cases of vehicles with externally mounted bogies losing a bogie after a particularly sharp knock. I can't think of any on operational vehicles outside of those caused by mine strikes, which were not uncommon and not just in World War II. You'd see it in Vietnam and the Mid-East as well. The mines would blow bogies off vehicles. As you hypothesize, it wasn't particularly a major problem, as the bogies could be replaced as long as the whole structure generally remained intact. It is to be noted that, of course, bogies are designed from the beginning to take a few knocks, and they have plenty of bolts holding them in place. If there weren't enough, the chances are that it would be noticed in the testing phase, and so the field units wouldn't be suffering bogies just randomly falling off. The other point is that the bogies aren't merely held in place by bolts. They normally have a shelf which kind of juts out underneath the main hull, so also reduces the strain on the bolts. You will see this sort of thing, for example, on the Panzer IV, the Valentine, and the Sherman. Striker 1959 wants to know about the T4, which the US Army's Armor and Cavalry Collection has been working on recently, which seems to be a Christie tank. Indeed, it is a Christie tank, and I'm actually going to reserve that question, I think, for a full answer in a separate dedicated video on the American Christies. Tim Pullman, are there cases where the recoil of a gun was so great that it would damage the tank itself,
or would topple over if fired from the side. Yes, but not necessarily in the manner you're probably thinking. Not least if it's a problem from firing from the side, it wouldn't get past testing anyway. Normally, the bit that's going to break first isn't the tank itself, but the mount, the bit which transfers the force from the recoil system to the rest of the tank. It would absolutely not be unusual during initial testing of new guns and mounts to find that the mount has been cracked or otherwise failed. Indeed, it may not even be because the gun is too powerful. It could have just been that the new mount, maybe one designed to be lighter or more efficient configuration, might have just been too weak. But hey, that's why they have testing. The other possibility might be not because of the gun being too powerful, but because of maintenance issues. Now, interestingly, I can't seem to find a picture of it, but if an M1 has a new gun fitted, or there is significant work done to the recoil system, the gun is proof fired on a range by use of a lanyard from outside the tank before anyone is allowed inside the tank when it fires. If the gun goes out of battery, the breech is going to bounce around inside the turret and basically kill anyone inside. 3 consecutive proof rounds must be fired before it's considered safe to fire from inside. I had one master gunner tell me that he had a tank fail on the 3rd round, despite the CO saying, "Stop wasting time," after the 2nd. Nightshade Chrome. What steering systems were effective in World War II and at the same time reliable? Well, effective, reliable, and easy to produce. The concept of tracked vehicle steering is probably best left to an engineering channel, and I don't necessarily understand it all. The simplest system is simply clutch braking. You pull the lever back a little bit and it disconnects the drive from the power output on that side. Power goes to the outside track only. Pull back more and the inside brake has a brake applied. Inside track has a brake applied. It's simple, but requires lots of brake pads, creates heat and so on, and the inside track has no power at any point during the turn. By the early 1920s, control differentials started to show up when the Cleveland Tractor Company makes them available, and they show up all around the world. A brake locks a set of gears for normal use, and pulling back to release it basically lets the internal gears rotate freely, reducing their effect, and that slows down the track. It's much easier on the brakes, but also reduces the flexibility a bit. A Sherman, as a result, has a fairly wide turning radius. Geared steering shows up at about the same time, and it basically requires 2 gearboxes, one for each track. On the plus side, there is always power going to both tracks. On the downside, you could be looking at quite a lot of stress in the system. Oh, and there's 2 gearboxes then. Then you get to the double and triple differentials. The Germans used doubles, and after the Churchill, the British used triples. The general concept is similar to a control diff, but there is greater fidelity to the control system instead of just generally having a brake on or off. Further, the output is reversible, which means that the neutral steering becomes a possibility. The British Merritt Brown gearbox is considered to be the best of the World War II steering systems, and I haven't heard any particular horror stories about maintenance on them. If they were that bad, I can't imagine that they would have kept them through half of the Cold War. And then there could be modifications on the type. So for example, the Char B1 used a hydrostatic transmission with a double differential, resulting in an extremely capable steering system, if it was maintained in accordance with instructions. Andrew Sebastian wants to know what combination of 2020s tanks and AFVs I would recommend for a budget-conscious, unaligned state trying to set up its first armoured brigade. It's interesting to see the encroachment of wheeled vehicles into what was previously the tracked domain, but you know the CV90 series is going to be in the running anyway. However, since I have not been granted permission to play around with the new stuff, nor have I been invited by any countries to visit comparative testing events, anyone out there, maybe? I don't think my opinion is going to be any more valid than yours on this matter, so I'm just going to skip it. Sorry. Charles Charange wants to know what was better, Irish rations or US rations. Breakfast was definitely better in Ireland, as they came with bacon and beans. The main difference was that the Irish rations came in a 24-hour ration pack complete with little hexamen tablets for flame heating, whilst MREs come per meal and have the excellent flameless heaters complete with meme instructions. I felt that the MREs were more practical, and they also came with more munchables, the sort of thing you might put in a spare ammo pouch when nibbling on the march. That said, I don't remember an Irish ration pack which I particularly disliked, but several MREs I would go out of my way to avoid. And again, that manicotti is way up there. Tsubomi Kido is doing some reading on Black Prince and seems to have found a discrepancy between PM Knight's book and David Fletcher's book. Either the Fletcher book is wrong or Kido's has misread it. So, reading from another book of Churchill's, correction, another book of Fletcher's, Mr. Churchill's Tank, it states, the ratios in the 5-speed box had been thought by some to be too close, but in practice they made driving a lot easier, despite the fact that it was now an entirely manual operation. A single shift from one gear to the next could be achieved in 0.75 of a second. So this matches the PM Knight description of the transmission being quite reasonable. However, the Fletcher's book continues, mind you, that did not leave much room for error. If the tank was travelling at 3.5 miles an hour and one wished to change gear, it did not do to bungle it. The tank was so sluggish that in 1.5 seconds the speed would drop from 3.5 mph to 0. Which presumably is the source of your numbers. So if you get your gear change right, by the time you get into second gear, the tank will have dropped to a little under 1 mile an hour, which, if the gear ratios are close, should be within the realm of acceptability for second gear. Spencer Loper is also prompted by the Black Prince video, I guess, particularly my comment that the British didn't slope the front partially due to difficulty in getting a good ball mount. He wants to know what was so hard about it, and honestly, I have no idea. The Germans, as noted, took a while to develop one as well, so the early Panthers didn't have a ball mount, just an open gap, which is a problem for armor integrity due to the edge effect if nothing else. Note that eventually the Americans also gave up on the sloped ball mounts from M26 on. The whole gun was more mounted on a vertical axis on the end of a bulge extension from the sloping front. As for the mechanics as to why it was so difficult, I honestly couldn't tell you. It doesn't make sense to me, but I'm not an engineer. Chase Walls, will I be at Tankfest this year? I refer to the commentary I made towards the beginning of this video. Bill Hollowell is a 1:48 scale modeler who wants to model an Aussie Abrams. What's the closest scale? And I should say is 1/48th aircraft. Your best bet is 1/35th, although there are 1/48th and 1A1 models out there. It's a bit of an odd scale for tank models. It was around a long while ago, and also it's O scale for model railroad types. But 1/35th became the default, and for those with absolutely no room on the shelves, 1/72. Maybe about 10 years ago, a little under, there was a bit of a resurgence of 1/48th armor to fill the gap between big enough for detail or old eyes and small enough to fit more than a couple of things on the shelf. And the number of kits in this scale is increasing. Most of the armor behind me here is 1/35th. However, although there are certainly aftermarket decals and parts for Aussie M1s and 1/35th, I am not sure if there are any for 1/48th, being still something of a minority scale. I could have sworn I'd sent you a link on Facebook or some such where I'd seen that question before, but if not, let me know and I will resend. Jackson Fox, Kubelwagen versus Jeep. He claims the Kubel is underestimated in many areas, often overlooked in comparisons, and generally gets a bad rep it doesn't deserve. Of course, the primary area it's compared to is the fact that the Jeep's a 4x4 and the Kubelwagen isn't, and most people will just stop there. Now, I will agree with you that Kubelwagen is an incredibly simple vehicle, not fitting in with the German reputation of over-engineering things. But I think the extra complication of the Jeep did not outweigh the dramatic increase in capability. Of course, there is a little bit of apples to oranges. Kubelwagen was never designed to be the jack of all trades that the Jeep turned out to be. It was a liaison vehicle and runabout. The Allies got all that and much, much more out of a Jeep. Now, if you can afford to have one vehicle as a runabout and one as a tactical vehicle, then yes, there is a place for a Kubelwagen type vehicle. And you will see all sorts of bizarre runabout vehicles tested by the US, like three-wheeled Jeeps or sidecar scooters, all of which were cheap and not particularly capable of towing things or going off-road. So Why bother? With ruthless efficiency, the US standardized on the light truck, which could do everything. It was perhaps a little bit overcapable for some purposes, though.
ISIO 896. How come the US did not use the M6 heavy tank? Well, they did, for propaganda. And it seems to have worked. The Japanese put out an intelligence bulletin on the best place to place satchel charges on the thing to destroy it. However, as for in the field, it didn't deploy for two main reasons. Firstly, they couldn't quite get it to work. It had issues with the suspension, which was HVSS but with external guide horns instead of center guides. The crew configuration was also a little bit dodgy, complete with a 37 where there probably shouldn't be one. More to the point though, it was just really damn big. As has been commonly observed, you could get two Shermans into the space of one M6, assuming you could even get the M6 onto the ship in the first place. I mean, remember, the thing just came in at a little under 60 tons. It was also shot down by Devers, the head of the armoured force. Now, his objection was interesting. Bear in mind that when the M6 Heavy was built, the 3-inch gun was basically the most powerful tank gun known to be on a tank anywhere. And, as a matter of fact, as Tiger hadn't been built yet, it probably was. In rejecting M6, Devers said that the improved firepower provided by the heavy tank was not worth the increase in armour, weight, fuel consumption, etc. that came with it. He was viewing the M6 primarily in terms of what punishment it could put out, not what punishment it could take. John Rayberger wants to know how often tank units train with other units. And the reason he asks is he was an infantry officer in 1st Armoured Division and he rarely trained with tankers. And that was generally my experience as well, albeit over 10 years ago. Back in the day, tank battalions and infantry battalions were entirely separate and only ever met up really for joint manoeuvres of brigade or higher sides. These days, tanks and Bradleys are at least in the same battalions, so in theory, joint training should be far more common. But still, you can bet that for at least half of the time, such as gunnery cycles, they are not any closer than they were before. Now, of course, the tank school moved to be closer to the infantry school. Naturally, the two schools are at the other ends of Fort Benning. Still, I would assume that at least the doctrinaires could benefit from being able to walk down the hallway to Manoeuvre Centre headquarters to talk to their opposite number from the other branch. Perhaps a current service chap can fill in the blank here for cross-training. RAW, and I don't know if that's RAW or just RAW. What was the first tank to have modular armour packages such as Merkava 4 and Leclerc? I have a suspicion it was T-72. Now, the Soviet idea of composite armor was basically to make a cavity in the main shape of the turret, which could then be filled in with stuff. Usually a composite stuff of various different materials, which would cause the penetrator to twist and which could attenuate shaped charge rounds. Now, whether or not that material could be pulled out again afterwards and then replaced, I'm not sure. M60A1s were also designed to have stuff in them, and that's why they had a new turret shape with flatter sides. The silica-based armor came in sheets. Never happened, obviously. Once you have the slab-sided tanks, though, like M1 and Leopard, that's where modular armor really starts to become a little bit more reasonable. And so then your question becomes, what's modular? Is it the entire outside of the tank can be removed and replaced, or is it that you can upgrade what's inside, such as just adding depleted uranium? Adam Schindler, how do I see ubiquitous digital cameras changing how a crewman sees outside his tank? Could a commander's selfie stick become the new name tag defilade? Could hold down morph into every tank concealed while a drone buzzes overhead? Well, we're sort of heading in that direction now. I don't believe drones are really the way forward, even if they kind of just autonomously fly in a fixed relationship to the tank, e.g. 20 feet above and forward. To the crewman viewing that, it may as well just be another sensor on the tank. It's basically what a CITV is now. If you look at basically any tank with a CITV these days, it's right at the very top of the tank, so should be the only thing showing. Operation of such a system with the drone would be no different to CITV use, basically monitor in front of you. This is of course entirely different from flying a drone around, and if you want to go that far, you want a drone operator in another vehicle, probably with a shared output to all the tanks.
That said, there is also something to be said for restricting access to this feed to prevent paralysis by overanalysis. Mast-mounted cameras obviously exist as well, and they perform the selfie stick function, although they tend only to be mounted on recon vehicles. And if you think about how much this thing's going to be swaying on top of a 20-foot pole on a moving vehicle, you can understand why they normally are only used from the halt. CITV and crows seems to be a pretty reasonable compromise between simplicity and turret down advantage. And of course it's close enough to be a practical use. I mean, if it's something that you're looking at that needs a 20-foot pole to see, as opposed to just sticking your CITV over the top, there's an argument that the tank crew doesn't really need to know the specifics anyway, and it can be something which gets fed through the intel chain. As long as they know the basics of what's out there, they can figure out the specifics closer. Horizontal volute. There's a Sherman or Stuart fan name if ever there was one. Why didn't they do to the 90mm or 17-pounder what they did to get the 76mm from the 3-inch gun? Lop a couple of inches off the gun to shorten and lighten it, and add propellant charge to make up the difference. Well, I'm afraid your first problem is that they didn't. The 76mm gun M1A1 is actually a couple of inches longer than the 3-inch gun M7, and the older gun also has almost a pound more propellant in a chamber a third bigger than the later gun. The reason that the 76 was so much lighter was advancement in metallurgy. They simply didn't need as much metal to do the job. And that said, one may inquire about the idea of basically sub-calibering the 90mm round. So if you look at a 17-pounder cartridge, it looks almost like somebody crimped a 3-inch round into a 90mm case. Why not just basically stick a 90mm breech onto a 76mm barrel and make an American 17-pounder equivalent? Well, really there's no great advantage to it. The reason that the US tried to keep the 76mm as long as possible, as I mentioned before, is ammunition capacity and ease of handling. You can get a lot more 76mm rounds into the same space than 17-pounder rounds, and they're a little quicker and easier to handle inside the confined space of a turret. So if you're going to have a big, fat round anyway, why not just use the larger caliber cannon? That way you can get a much better HE round, and you can still get the increase in penetration and velocity of a smaller projectile by use of HVAP or SABO. Of course, you can always take the ratio of case size to projectile to extremes. Look at the .22 Irrgesplitten Laudenboomer. Yes, that's a real round. And in theory, they could make it in tank size. But by that point, you've likely reached a point of diminishing returns. You need to have some significant mass in your projectile, partially to retain velocity over distance, and partially to make sure it doesn't just get converted into energy at the far end. If you look at a modern 120 Sabre round, it's a much larger case than the 76mm, but the projectile is barely 1.5 inches or 2 inches in diameter. Doubtless, the engineers are still refining the length to diameter metallurgy question for further improvement. Dean, with the gradual change in doctrine towards conflict in built-up urban zones and supercities, might tank design eventually shift towards slow, heavily armed and armored vehicles as opposed to the fast MBT geared towards fighting in open terrain at range? I doubt it. Even as the cities grow, more and more of the planet's population are living in them, there is still in most cases quite a bit of open ground between one city and the next, and you need to have a traditional MBT for that. I think it'll be quite a few years before we get to megacities, but if you want to have an exercise in having your mind blown, go to Google Maps, turn on satellite view, and take a look at Singapore. You'll see it's almost entirely built up. Then ask yourself, where in the hell is supposed to keep 180 tanks, 2,000 APCs, and 150 artillery pieces, let alone actually use them in combat? Yes, I know a good portion of them are kept overseas for training where there's actually room to train, but still. About the only major open areas on the 30 by 17 mile island are open because the Air Force needs to have places somewhere amongst those 5.5 million citizens from which to fly their 100 fighters, and basically it's fighting in cities, and that's it. Oh, and a couple of golf courses. Yet you will notice that although they have certainly toughened up their leopards a bit, as have all the other Leopard 2A4 purchases out there these days, their IFVs are still in the 30-ton range. They've seen no particular need to go to the heavy APC system that the Israelis are famous for. If there was ever a military which could both afford and need heavy, high-angle, short-range systems such as the BMPT, it surely would be Singapore, but they just haven't seen the merit in it. And of course, even at under 500 meters, a 120mm cannon is still a pretty effective weapon. So your answer for megacities probably lies in there somewhere. Keep a further eye on Singapore. Maybe the first judges will show. Reagan Thomas Slatter. When did the US come up with a system to fill their vehicles in the field besides jerrycans? World War II, sort of. Of the 500,000 or so CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, approximately 4,500 of them were built as 750-gallon tankers, with a hose to a nozzle just like today's refuelers. However, the vast majority of them went to the Army Air Force for refueling aircraft. I mean, you think a tank has a lot of fuel, even a P-51 carries almost twice as much as a Sherman, and heaven forbid trying to fill a B-24 with jerrycans. As a result, if you were refueling your M4 medium, you were almost certainly using jerrycans to do it. That said, the Germans also had fuelers for ease of operation, and it is hard to imagine that nobody in the US Army saw one and said to himself, hang on a second, and then promptly led a raid on the local Army airfield. Still, the official answer for the US Army didn't show up until the early 1950s. Unlike the earlier CCKW truck tank gasoline, the 1,200-gallon M49 was designated as a truck tank fuel servicing, and it came with a pump capable of dispensing 80 gallons per minute. It was soon joined by the M217, although the 217's pump was only 60 gallons per minute, but on the plus side, it had an automatic transmission. Either way, you would be lucky to be a tank crewman refueling one of these in Korea, but it might not be entirely unheard of. Andrew, last name unknown, wants to know what's the point of Lahat and the other gun-launched ATGMs. Well, for the Soviets, it was to provide accurate long-range shots, but primarily at missile vehicles, where a heat or HE round might miss, but you could certainly try it at a tank or a helicopter. Soviet missiles were far faster than a TOW. As for why the Israelis have them, though, that's a very good question. One of my patrons was an Israeli tank commander, and he didn't know either, although his Merc was an earlier version without one. It's not inconceivable to do some long-range shooting in the area. There are some places with very long lines of sight. It probably requires information that the Israelis aren't releasing, however, to answer this. One possibility might simply be akin to the M1A1 not returning a ballistic solution beyond 4,000 meters. Either way, for now, we'll just mark that down as a watch this space. Virginia Artilleryman, I'm going to have to reserve your question for the next Q&A. I have it on the hard drive of a laptop. I have an AAR from Italy, which was a survey of fire direction systems by tank destroyer battalions, but that laptop is currently about 100 miles from me, and I'm not going to get it back until next week. Sorry. Timo Fiebig, what think I of the tankette concept, such as Wiesel 2, and if it makes sense, why don't other countries use them? Well, it's not a tankette, it's a weapons carrier. The difference being really that tankettes were a primary maneuver system, but weapons carriers merely provide support to other elements, mainly paratroops. I know Wikipedia specifically identifies it as a tankette, and they cite Tank Encyclopedia, but I disagree. Still, it is an interesting question. Why is it basically the only vehicle of its type in service worldwide? The ASU-57 is the closest thing. I can only presume that other nations have other solutions to the problem. The US, of course, just throws dollars at the problem. Lots of people have Javelin missiles to shoot at bunkers, or entire attack helicopter brigades, which the paratroopers can presumably call on for a little bit of a hand. Or light vehicles mounting TOW missiles could be an option, say VBL. On the other extreme, there's the M551, which stayed in frontline service until 1997. Still, apparently the US has decided that having something with a cannon isn't the worst idea. So a little over a year ago, the 82nd Airborne reactivated 4th Battalion, 68th Armoured Regiment using LAV 25A2s. Otherwise, for missiles and the like, wheeled vehicles, Humvees, VBLs, etc. seem to suffice. At the other end, the Mobile Protected Firepower vehicle is much more capable than a Wiesel, but accordingly far bigger and heavier. The two contenders are supposed to enter testing later this month. In the blue corner is yet another warmed over MAAGS, and in the red corner is General Dynamics' inhuman love child between an Abrams and an Ajax. Then again, the US has plenty of C-17s to carry the things. Honestly though, I would think that if a country didn't have the resources of the US, but they did have enough money to add in another vehicle type, I would think they would do quite well with Wiesel. I'm not sure what the British Parachute Regiment makes of it all if they feel like they're missing out on something. Finally, Connor Dodman wants to know if I think tank designers will start using transparent aluminium for protected optics. I have no idea. It comes down to whether it's more expensive than the stuff they're currently using or if it's any better or not. One also needs to ensure that it's not going to negatively affect special optics like thermal imagers. It is a question that a metallurgist will have to answer. Sorry. So there we have it. Next stop, Brazil, which should get me a few more vehicles to add to the Swedish line. It'll keep me going for a while after the Munster series from All the Tanks ends. So that's done. I hope you found it interesting and informative. Take care. I'll see you on the next one.